You know, you saw something the other day, wasn't long ago, with Moroccans pouring into Spain. Tens of thousands. And it happened pretty much all at once. There are estimates anywhere from 40 to 60, maybe even 80,000. They're still counting. Complete lawlessness, complete elimination of Spain's sovereignty. Spain is a leader, I guess he's a president, who is a disaster. He's a disgrace. He's a leftist. He's a socialist. And this is important to understand. When these leftists and socialists, Labour Party, Liberal Party, whatever they call themselves throughout Europe, when they take control of their governments, they are destroying their countries through immigration, revolution by immigration, because they figure that those are voters who are going to vote for the hard left. And they're right. Same thing happens in America. What happened during the 4 years of Biden, I would argue even during Obama, open borders, massive illegal immigration into our country. But it occurred over a 4-year period, and we're talking about millions and millions and millions of illegal aliens coming into the United States. And there's a reason for this. And I want to go through this with you carefully, because we have midterm elections coming up. We have another presidential election coming up in 2028, and the president, our president, is correct when he says, in 3 years, if the Democrats take over, this is what's going to happen. And we know that's true because it happened under Biden. And under Trump, he sealed that border tight. And now the problem is trying to find all the illegals and remove them because the Democrats are sabotaging and obstructing that. But first, as a reminder, let's take a look at what happened just a couple of days ago as Moroccans poured into Spain by the tens of thousands and nobody stopped them. Go. And I want you to notice something. There's not little girls, not women, all men, all military-age men pouring into Spain. Spain already has an illegal immigration problem given their president. Spain is destroying itself. Spain doesn't have the will to survive. And so this party, the radical left party that runs Spain, is systematically destroying that country. The way Britain has destroyed Britain, France has destroyed France, and virtually every European country in between. You don't even get the full sense of what's taking place here. They came in by boats. They came in by land. They came in masses. But you know what, ladies and gentlemen? It reminded me of something that happened 2 years ago or so in our own country when Biden opened the border and tens of thousands of people were rushing our border. Take a look at this just as a reminder. Go. This is the United States of America under the Democrats, under Biden. Thousands and thousands of illegal aliens pouring into our country, the vast majority of whom, again, are military-age young men. Men. You don't see a lot of women and a lot of children here, do you? Except in our case, there were more. Over the course of 4 years, there were millions. Anywhere estimate from 8 million to 15 million to 20 million. We really don't know. We really don't know. Clearly in violation of our immigration laws. And Biden ordered our people to stand down. He had a responsibility under the Constitution to enforce the law, and he didn't. He did the opposite. The Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, the Democrats in Congress, they were all involved in it because it is to their political advantage to destroy our country, Let's get into this. Let's start from the beginning. What exactly is the purpose of immigration, at least in our country? The purpose of immigration is to improve our country and support the existing citizenry. The government is supposed to represent you and me, not foreigners. It is not to replace the citizenry, you, Mr. and Mrs. America, with foreigners for the purpose of serving the political interests of the Democrat Party and their ideology. It is not to serve the revolutionary agenda of ideological radicals. It is not to change the demographics of the population in pursuit of some racist agenda or addressing some perceived historical injustice. Revolution by immigration, I call it, that is the demographic and social transformation of the United States, is what the Democratic Socialists of America, Marxists, communists, and the Democrat Party, that is what they seek. That is what they were delivering under Joe Biden. And should they control Congress and the presidency in the next few election cycles, you will see the end of America as we know it. Because the transformation is like that. It is the intended and purposeful ideological policy of the Democrat Party, not just the Marxists and the DSA, but the Democrat Party, to fundamentally change the citizenry in order to win elections and gain power. We see this from left-wing parties, again, throughout Europe, Spain, Britain, France, and beyond. You will also notice there's no discussion, let alone effort of any kind, to vet foreigners, to assimilate foreigners into our culture, or to insist that they swear allegiance to our country. None. In fact, many of these foreigners come to the country for the purpose of overthrowing it and imposing their ideological and religious beliefs on us, such as the Islamists. The DSA insists on open borders, abolishing ICE, which enforces our immigration laws and as a matter of law deports illegal aliens, and the Democrat Party also seeks to abolish ICE, had open borders under Biden, opposes deportations, and confers benefits on illegal aliens such as Medicaid and other welfare subsidies. Illegal aliens, that is foreigners here illegally, are counted in the census and benefits only one party, the Democrat Party. And the Democrat Party wants to use illegal aliens to increase their representation in the House of Representatives, and they want to use so-called birthright citizenship. Thank you for nothing, Supreme Court, to register more Democrats in the longer term. This is why the Democrat Party and the DSA are essentially aligned on the issue of immigration. Now let's go further back. Our founders, Alexander Hamilton, he's fairly popular, right? Even with the left. He said, the safety of a republic depends essentially on the energy of a common national sentiment, on a uniformity of principles and habits, exemption of citizens from foreign bias and prejudice, and on the love of country, which will almost invariably be found to be closely connected with birth, education, and family. Foreigners will generally be apt to bring with them attachments to the persons they have left behind, to the country of their nativity, and to the particular customs and manners. They will also entertain opinions on government congeal with those under which they lived, or if they should be led hither from a preference to ours, how extremely unlikely it is they will bring with them that temperate love of liberty so essential to real republicanism. Hamilton. And he added this, in the recommendation to admit indiscriminately foreign immigrants of every description to the privileges of American citizens, on their first entrance into our country, there is an attempt to break down national spirit and national character, and to let in the most powerful means of perverting and corrupting both the one and the other. George Washington feared that when too many immigrants settle in our country at once, and usually in enclaves, it is problematic and it undermines assimilation. He said the policy or advantage of immigration taking place in a body, I mean the settling of them in a body, meaning in one place, may be much questioned, for by doing so, they retain the language, habits, and principles, good or bad, which they bring with them, whereas by an intermixture with our people, they or their descendants get assimilated to our customs, measures, and laws. In a word, soon become one people. Well, we're not seeing this in these enclaves, these Islamist fortresses and enclaves throughout the country, where Sharia law is the rule and not the Constitution. As Professor Thomas West wrote in his great book, Vindicating the Founders, Washington's openness to common citizenship with those who were neither Protestants nor descendants from Englishmen did not lead him to favor unlimited immigration. He believed that immigrants of the wrong sort in the wrong quantity would endanger American liberty. You know, like people come into the country and want to overthrow it. I don't think Washington or any of the founders would have thought that was particularly smart. The purpose of government is to secure the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's your declaration. Immigration policy, like all public policy, must be tailored to that end. And when Washington affirmed American openness to immigrants, quote, of all nations and religions, unquote, he continued by saying, quote, we shall welcome them to a participation of all our rights and privileges, if by decency and propriety of conduct they appear to merit the enjoyment. Likewise, he didn't say to the Newport Jews that people of all religions were welcome in America, regardless of their conduct. He said that the government requires, quote, that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it, on all occasions, their effectual support. So if you come in to this country as an Islamist and say, I am here to impose our faith on you, to destroy Christianity and Judaism, and we have imams all over this country saying it, Washington would say, get them out and get them out as fast as you can. James Madison, during a speech in the first U.S. Congress on February 3, 1790, while debating the rules for naturalization and American citizenship and the purpose of immigration, he said, not merely to swell the catalog of people, no, sir. It is to increase the wealth and strength of the community and those who acquire the rights of citizenship without adding to the strength or wealth of the community are not the people we are in want of. Unfortunately, that is the exact opposite, isn't it, of the goal of the Democrat Party, the DSA, the Marxists, the Islamists in our country. They seek American disunity and America's destruction. Let's be honest about this. That's what's going on. Ihan Salam, president of the Manhattan Institute, himself a Muslim American, writing last month in Saper, he explains that policymakers need to come to grips with the growth of the Muslim community in America. He writes of two ideological tendencies within the American Muslim population. He says it's in a minority, but it's powerful. That is distinct in their character, different in their dangers, and yet mutually reinforcing. This is important. He says the first is Islamism, a transnational revolutionary ideology that seeks to capture state power in order to impose Islamic law that rejects any separation between religious authority and political life. Islamism commands the allegiance of a distinct minority of American Muslims, he writes, but its most dangerous manifestation, jihadism, or the turn to violence in pursuit of Islamist objectives, is an urgent threat. The second is third worldism. Listen to this. A fusion of anti-Zionism, anti-Westernism, anti-capitalism that places the sacralized victimhood of Palestinian Arabs at the center of a larger struggle against American so-called imperialism. Unlike Islamism, third worldism is not primarily a religion-based ideology. Its most committed adherents, such as Mandami himself, tend to lead largely secular lives, but in important respects, it presents the more consequential long-term ideological challenge, where jihadism targets American civilians as part of a larger struggle to overthrow apostate regimes in the Muslim world. Third worldism endeavors to transform the nation's ideological, intellectual milieu, shaping how Americans, well beyond the Muslim minority, understand their country and its place in the world. And I contend that it is this third worldism of which Salam writes, which actually extends beyond aspects of the Muslim community, that fuses with the Marxist ideology. Why? Because the DSA and their ilk, including the Democrat Party, they promote the overthrow of our constitutional construct, which overthrows our republic and our economic system. Professor Edward Erler, reflecting Aristotle's observation, he wrote, a radical change in the character of the citizens, meaning through immigration, will be tantamount to a regime change, just as surely as a revolution in its political principles, revolution by immigration. The Democrat Party is all in, as are these other aspects of it. Today, we have a lack of assimilation by more recent immigrants, supported by intellectual elites in the West, our country. Of course, that's a nation's death warrant. Most non-Western civilizations resent Western values. In the case of Islamists, of course, they've not only contempt for Western civilization, but seek to destroy it because it's the main barrier to the revelation of the 12th Imam, an earthly paradise for the true believers. For the Marxists, the entire purpose is the destruction of a free and open society, the enslavement of the so-called working class, the middle class, in service to the state, the so-called collective good. In a 1919 letter written by former U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt to the American Defense Society, expressing his views on American identity, civic duty, and immigration, he said the following: "In the first place, we should insist that if the immigrant who comes here in good faith becomes an American and assimilates himself to us, he shall be treated on an exact equality with everyone else, for it is an outrage to discriminate against any such man because of creed or birthplace or origin. But this is predicated upon the person's becoming in every facet an American, and nothing but an American. There can be no divided allegiance here. Any man who says he's an American, but something else also, isn't an American at all. We have room for but one flag, the American flag. We have room for but one language here, and that is the English language. And we have room for but one sole loyalty, and that is the loyalty to the American people," unquote. The sabotaging of our immigration system and using it to benefit these ideologies and the Democrat Party, which makes much of this possible, as the left-wing governments do in Europe and Canada and Australia and so forth, plays a key part, if not the key part, in advancing this anti-Western, anti-American, in our case, agenda. No borders, no deportations, no ICE, no funding for ICE, no vetting, no limits. Overwhelm the system, defund the system, destroy the system. That's what you saw on those two videotapes. That's what's happening. Donald Trump has put an end to it. But Donald Trump is not president forever. And we saw what happened with the Democrats before Trump. We know what they'll do after Trump, even some Republicans. So we need to confront this, and we need to push back. And people who are here illegally are supposed to be removed under our laws. The Democrats say, "Why are you removing everybody? I thought you were just concentrating on the criminals." Excuse me. They passed the statutes. Other presidents have signed it, and it requires the removal of people who are here illegally. It doesn't matter if they commit additional crimes. They need to go too. But they are to be removed. So the Democrat Party's agenda is this: open borders to the whole world when they're in power, and no deportations when they're in power and they're out of power. That's why they hate ICE. That's why they attack ICE.
Be sure to like and subscribe for all the Fox News latest on YouTube, and catch full shows streaming now on Fox One.